Hello, welcome back. Welcome to Mill City Roasters. This is our Roaster School, Season 2, Episode number 3.
Wow, Trace.
If you did not see Episode 1 or 2, please go back right now, check those out, because we're moving forward today. We're going to be talking about browning reactions. My name is Joe Morocco, and I'm joined by...
Derek De La Paz, browning expert.
Browning expert, that's exactly right. I mean, we had Derek on last episode because he's a roasting expert, and we're having him on again because you are just an all-around cooking expert, a culinary artist.
Totally. I'm an expert at the art of browning.
That's exactly right. We hear Derek a lot of times talk about how he has made a career out of just simply turning things brown.
I love it, for sure. I think I've, all my bank accounts, all my checks that I've ever deposited, everything I've ever purchased has all been on the backs of my application of heat to things and turning them brown. And usually trying to make them somewhat more consumable, I should say.
Yep. So our last episode, we talked about the first part of the roasting process, which is just simply putting coffee into the drum, getting that coffee to change from green to being yellow. And now we're going to be talking about yellow on to first crack, which is what we call the browning reactions.
Nice.
But I want to kind of peel back a little bit away from just simply talking about coffee in general and talk about browning reactions from a much more general perspective.
Yeah.
And you having well more than a decade of experience as a chef, I think that you're the perfect person to talk to us about this today.
Wow, I appreciate it, for sure. Yeah, I mean, browning has been, it's been at the core of basically what I've done through my career in the culinary arts, you know what I mean? And it's strange to think about, you know what I mean? But I think if I have to start somewhere, it would probably be with onions.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people first learn about development, roast development, flavor development with the process of caramelizing onions. Yeah, I mean, it's really simple. I mean, I think a lot of us have had onions, raw onion. You know, be really honest, we could probably all go to Subway right now and probably try some old raw onion. You know, probably be a little bitter, a little bit sharp, you know what I mean? Because it was just improperly stored after being cut. But then the next phase would be then the caramelized onion, you know what I mean? Which most of us have probably had, you know, in some capacity, maybe around a patty melt or some other kind of, you know, diner food that had caramelized onions, hash browns maybe, I want to say. So like the basic difference between that raw, sharp onion and then the caramelized, sweet brown onion. You know, it was basically like, you know, to be really honest, like I think I've made a lot of my money and a lot of my skill, a lot of the things I've done in my career has been in understanding that and trying to better apply science or to better apply myself to that process.
That's incredible. You mentioned a word in there that I want to flesh out a little bit more. You said sweet.
Sweet, definitely.
So you can take an onion and you can make it sweet. How do you do that?
That's a good question. Yeah, because if you do look at the grocery store, you will see sweet onions. So we're talking about something different here. You know what I mean? Yeah, that's a good idea, or that's a good piece of information. Like we should really feather out and break down what we're actually doing. So I guess in the beginning, the first thing that I, from my kind of more layman science side would say was the beginning of the process would be an application of heat to the onions and then a release of moisture. So once I start applying heat to the pan, you know, you chop up the onions, you put a little fat in the pan, you heat it up a little bit, you add your onions to the pan, you apply a little bit of heat, a little bit of energy, and then the immediate reaction you'll see steam coming off the pan. You know what I mean? And usually at that point is when I turn the pan down a little bit. You know what I mean? I usually want to drive that steam reaction just to kind of push the moisture out of the onion. As soon as I see that happening, then I bring the temperature down quite a bit. I bring the temperature down quite a bit to just keep that steaming kind of reaction going. Because I could very easily keep the heat up really high, the kind of energy I need to get that steam reaction going. And then if I keep that much energy input going, then I'm going to start to burn the onion. And I'm going to instantly go from a raw onion to a kind of burnt, it will have some notes of caramelization and it will get a little bit sweet, but it'll be more bitter. It'll be more of a bitter-edged cooked onion. Where the reasoning behind lowering the heat right when it hits that steam point is then to slow down the reactions to then create more sugars. If I slow it down a little bit right there and I apply the heat a little bit more thoughtfully and a little bit gentler, then I can build chemical reactions within the onion, thus increasing the sweetness.
So essentially what you're saying is the onion starts bitter, but by controlling your heat application process, you're able to take that bitter onion and take bitterness away from it, isolating that sweetness. But if you don't do it right, you're going to have a bitter onion no matter what.
You can add bitterness in too,
yeah.
totally, for sure. So we're removing some of the natural intrinsic bitterness in the fruit or the vegetable, or whatever we're going to talk about. But then we do have the ability to add in bitterness from over caramelization. But the goal is to not do that, and instead is to control the reaction to just develop the sweetness.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So one of the major reactions that we work with within coffee specifically is that caramelization reaction, which is the dehydration of a sugar molecule. So as that sugar molecule begins to dehydrate and break down, it does exactly that. It goes from being something that is sweet to being something that is specifically more and more bitter. I think a lot of times people think that if they caramelize a coffee more, that it's going to be sweeter, but it's really the reverse of that. So we know this too, because if we take a dark roast and taste it up against a lighter roast or a medium roast, the dark roast is the most bitter of those roasts.
Right. We've definitely brought some bitterness to the cup by going so far in the development, or going so far in the process, I should say, the chemical processes.
And just like you spoke about with the onion, if you move that coffee too quickly from your yellowing point, or even before your yellowing point, if you move that coffee too quickly, you will build bitterness. You will get those scorch notes. We hear Steve talks a lot about heat defect, and that's basically what we're talking about here.
Totally. And you can go the other side too, I want to say, and you can go too slow and too low, and then you create, which would be very sweet onions, you create these onions that are sweet, but they kind of lack character. They're a little bit flat, they're a little bit plain, they're only one-dimensionally sweet. And for me, that's kind of equally as bad as the bitter burnt ones, the ones that are as one-dimensionally sweet. I like somewhere in the middle where you still get a little bit of the flavor of the onion, you still get a little bit of the natural bitterness of the onion, but then you have that deep caramelization that really adds flavor and kind of adds complexity to the onion itself.
Yeah, and one of the things that adds complexity to coffee is that other browning reaction that's called the Maillard reaction. Now, this is a rabbit trail that we could get very lost in the weeds on. And if you want to, in our season number 1, in our browning reaction video, we really get into all of the molecular exchanges. I don't want to talk about all of that today, though. I just want to focus on more of the culinary side of this. So Maillard reaction is we call it a reaction, but it's really hundreds of reactions.
Right.
We just don't know which are happening at what time. What we know is that it adds complexity. So tell me what your perspective of the Maillard reaction is, maybe even versus caramelization.
Yeah, that's a good one, huh? I guess the Maillard reaction for me is a little bit about the slow controlled browning or sweetening of the sugars. You know what I mean? It's for me, caramelization is more an overarching kind of browning, like we were saying, but the Maillard is more of I don't know how the best way to word it might be, is a cascade of chemical reactions that are occurring within the caramelization path, I want to say, that create specific types of flavors. And understanding how to navigate that path is very, very complex. And it's a little bit, to be really honest, a little bit over my science knowledge.
Yeah, I think it's over all of our science knowledge, and it's over our technical measuring capability.
Right.
Because we don't have a tool basically to measure what exact reactions are happening while the Maillard reaction is going on. What we know is that if we have a sugar molecule present, if we have a protein molecule present or amino acid molecule present, that as we get things hot, we basically get a soup of reactions.
Yes.
And if the sugar is kind of by itself, it's going to caramelize as it breaks down. If that sugar is interacting with the amino acids, we're going to get a new molecule altogether that's going to give us more of what you spoke about, which is complexity. So the complexity is those specific molecules that give us, like when we taste the flavor of orange, for instance, what reminds us of orange is a molecule that goes into our brain from our nose. What reminds us of sweet and acid, that would be the molecules that go on our tongue. So that sugar molecule, if we break it down more, it might taste like caramelized orange. But if we break it down less, it might taste like sugar and orange or something like that.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
So essentially, in order to take a coffee, take it from this raw state where it has some sugar in it, it has a lot of other things in it, but it's kind of useless.
Right.
It's totally worthless until you, the roaster, get your hands on it and turn it brown. So what you're saying is, if we were to use the onion as an example, if we go too slow on the coffee or too fast on the coffee, what happens?
Yeah, so if we're gonna, let's start with the too fast one, because I think that's gonna be the one that's gonna happen most or right away, right off the get-go, is too fast. It's, basically what you're gonna do is you're gonna overdevelop or over-caramelize the exterior of the bean, you know what I mean? You're not gonna get that energy deep into the interior of the bean, and you're basically gonna create like what would be called, like you're gonna increase bitterness. Like the whole goal of this process is to increase sweetness, to minimize some of the natural bitterness within the bean, and then to caramelize these sugars to create some sweetness.
Yep.
So if we hit it with too much energy from the get-go, then we're basically gonna expedite some of the chemical reactions that would be considered probably some of the negative caramelization reactions or Maillard reactions, which would increase bitterness. That way we'll overcook the exterior of the bean, we'll have a raw interior. So we're kind of doing a double whammy to ourselves. Not only overdeveloping the caramelization and adding some bitterness to it, but then we're not gonna have the development within the seed properly either, and then that's gonna leave some natural bitterness from the seed.
Yeah.
So that's gonna be completely out of balance, and it's also gonna lack complexity. It'll have complexity in kind of wacky ways, rawness and over caramelization, but not the kind of complexity we look for. So now the other side of it, which is too low, too slow, we're basically gonna, to a certain degree, minimize the nuance, minimize the complexity of the bean, and kind of in a way, some roasters might call it baking. I kind of want to stay away from that term a little bit. I think it's being used in lots of different ways. But what we would do is we would soften the coffee so much and soften all the nuance qualities of it so much by going so slow through these processes that we would never really make any distinct specific complexity or nuance. We would pretty much just kind of get rid of everything exciting and just get this really minimal soft thing. And it's kind of like the two bookends of the style. We have the baked one, and then we have the underdeveloped one, and then we want to stay somewhere in the middle, I want to say.
Yeah. So what you're saying by coffee that's maybe too soft is a good term for that, maybe boring?
Boring, totally. Yeah, boring.
I totally agree with you on that. I think that our job as roasters is to take a coffee and find where it's at its most exciting or its most unique. Usually where it's the most unique is where that coffee really shines. And that's what we use the term specialty. That's really what we mean is a coffee that's really special.
Right.
So we as roasters, if we can find where that coffee shines its best, we've done a good service to the coffee. I'm going to postulate, however, that sometimes you may have to push it too fast and you may have to bring it too slow to kind of find where that middle ground is. What is your process for that?
I totally agree, for sure. So every green coffee is going to be a little different, as we both know, you know what I mean? And some coffees are going to have naturally high amounts of sweetness. Some coffees are going to have naturally high amounts of acidity. So once you get the baseline understanding of your green coffee, then you have to understand how to basically get to that sweet spot of that coffee. You know what I mean? So I buy this new coffee, I cup it, I realize it has a high amount of sweetness and it has a pretty low amount of acidity. You know what I mean? For me in that coffee. But I want to create a nice balanced cup for my customer. My customer expects balance. You know what I mean? Just because the way I've developed my brand. So basically with that coffee, I'm probably, because it's got such a high amount of sweetness, I'm probably going to make a thoughtful decision to move a little quicker through the roast to basically minimize the development of sweetness and to minimize the removal of acid from that cup to kind of create more balance through it. That would probably be some of my base thought. Now, if I cupped that original green coffee and I found that it had really high acidity and really low sweetness, I would probably reverse the logic a little bit. And I would probably want to go a little bit lower and slower through the roast process to try and bring out some of the sweetness that coffee didn't have through the roast craft. And I'd probably try and minimize some of the natural acidity within that bean. I think that would be the basic way I would start that process.
That's awesome. And I know that we've talked a lot about the caramelization and Maillard reactions.
Right.
We haven't really addressed it on the curve.
Sure.
I have said that it kind of starts where you start seeing yellow.
Yeah.
I am also going to postulate that it doesn't end until you finish the roast, basically.
I agree. I think you're right. Totally, for sure. For sure. I think that once we hit yellow, we're starting to develop flavor and nuance, complexities. The Maillard caramelization process has begun. And I think it travels all the way till you're done. I mean, even in the cooling tray a little bit, carryover cooking. So we have a little bit happening in the tray, right up to probably going into the package, to be honest, And then probably, depending on how it gets stored, maybe some along the way too.
Yep, absolutely. There are Maillard reactions that can happen at room temperature, believe it or not.
Right,
So,
I like it.
Yeah.
That's super exciting.
So if we have that roast curve and we have hit yellow and we're starting to move through our browning reactions, then all of a sudden we have this magical moment that we call first crack.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And I think that there are a lot of people out there that think that first crack is an actual instigator to Maillard reaction or caramelization.
Sure.
What is your thought around first crack? How do you view it?
Right. I think we have a little bit of rapport, so I think I know what you're getting at here a little bit. And so I'd say at green to yellow transition, there's in no moment in the roast do we relax. There's never a good moment in the roast to like answer a phone call. So we're just gonna say that straight out. Like that's never a good idea. But there is certain moments in the roast where it's a little bit more like, okay, I'm on it, and a little bit less like, hey, I can kind of just look and see what's happening with the process. And I want to say green to yellow transition. That transition is the beginning. It's the coffee telling you, pay attention to me. Like start to pay attention to me. Things are happening, right? I mean, previous to green to yellow transition, if you're on the trier, you're on the sight glass, there's not a lot happening. You might see a slight change of color. You might smell a little humidity coming off the bean. But then when you hit green to yellow transition, then you pull that trier and oh my gosh, there's a whole new set of aromas in there. A whole new set of smells, right?
Yeah.
It's a whole new process.
Yep.
So that tells me in my layman's science world, chemical reactions are happening massively at green to yellow transition.
I agree.
And they're basically escalating, de-escalating through that whole process right up to cool. You know what I mean? So really first crack is in a way kind of like the middle of the transitional stage of the coffee, I should say, flavor transition. So if you're just jumping on your roast and figuring out what's happening at crack, you've already missed the boat. You've already missed the boat's left the dock. You're still at the dock. You might still be able to salvage and get a pretty nice cup out of that, but you should have been paying attention way earlier in the game. First crack is basically the audible pop, but it's not the beginning of chemical change or of flavor creation.
Yeah, in fact, if there is no chemical change that's taking place in your coffee, you won't have first crack. And you can test this actually. You can get coffee that is kind of devoid of all intrinsic characteristic, a really low grown coffee that doesn't have a lot of density. That really low grown, low density coffee, when you move to first crack, you can barely hear anything.
Right.
And it may be swelling and it may never actually have the internal power
the pressure
to push that coffee open. But what causes that pressure is chemical reactions that are unfolding. Like you said, I love your term, cascade of chemical reactions. That's unfolding, and as that happens, you cannot have a chemical reaction without some part of that molecule being released and a little bit of a release of energy. As that happens, it basically inflates that seed from the inside. And if you have a lot of chemical reaction, how does first crack sound?
It pops. It's like an audible pop. And it might even be like, like a lot of them, you know what I mean? Like a really intense crack, depending on how you're hitting it with energy. It's an exciting moment, you know what I mean, as a roaster.
You'll find that those really dense, like fresh coffees, they pop so loud.
Like the Kenyans killing it.
Oh man, it's so great. They're big. The sound is so, there's so much size to that bean. It's kind of like a big guitar. So
I never thought of that.
When you have that pop, it just
radiates out through that fiber.
Exactly.
That bean, the matter. Wow, that's exciting. You're right.
But on those smaller beans, if you don't have density and it's a smaller bean, you might have a very soft first crack. So my advice to you is that you should mark where first crack is, because it is a milestone. It is something that's actually happening that you can mark. But don't rely upon first crack to say, okay, now caramelization is starting, or now pyrolysis is starting, or whatever the reaction is that you're looking for. Know that reactions are happening all the way, and you need to be paying attention, like Derek has very wisely advised. Pay attention throughout the entire roast, because things are happening that entire time. That's why I personally like to talk about pre-first and post-first development, because you obviously, after first crack happens, those reactions are speeding up a lot. So that's where you're going to be deciding to finish your coffee, which we'll talk about later. But as you are prior to first crack, you're deciding really what kind of characteristics you want that coffee to have.
I think pre-first crack and the way you approach it is really defining the personality of your coffee. The exact traits of that personality that will be in the cup forefront, like first trait, second trait, third trait, when you taste the cup, that's probably gonna be post-crack, how you navigate that terrain. But pre-crack, you're really deciding on the personality of that coffee. You know, and if you're way off, if you're way fast, you're way slow, then that's going to be the personality of the cup that you're going to get. You know, and you definitely control that, and you can change it a little bit post-crack, but that pre-crack development is really the guide to get to where you need to go, you know. And so if you're off, or if you're trying something that's a little different, you really need to gain control of that pre-crack, you know what I mean? And then from there, execute, you know. And I think that what you said earlier about tracking your first crack is super important. You're gonna pick up all kinds of data off of the variations of crack or the intensity of crack. So in no way are we saying that it's not like a really important part of the roast. You definitely record it, you'll learn a lot from it, but it's not as if the flavor begins at crack.
Yeah. And I've seen you pay a lot of attention at first crack, and I have learned from you when exactly to mark first crack. And something that I really want to encourage all of our watchers to do is kind of use a very similar way to mark first crack. How do you go about that?
Yeah, it's tough, you know what I mean? Like I've ebbed and flowed throughout my career, you know what I mean? And so for the last year and a half, I've been really trying to use the 3 pops. So 3 together, pop, pop, pop. You know, not like pop, 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 or pop, 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 but pop, pop, pop. You know, when the 3 together, that's when I call them. And the reason why, I'm going to say it was like 4 years ago, the big term at the Roasters Guild was outliers. There was a bunch of outlier cracks. And I think that was the first time I really thought about it. And then I started kind of tracking outlier cracks. I'm going to have an outlier crack.
I kind of feel like an outlier crack sometimes.
I think we're both outlier cracks, generally. I'm a later development outlier, though. You know what I mean? I'm like, that really, was that still a pop? I thought we were in the second. That was really late, you know? But yeah, I think that I've heard outliers a minute before I would call full crack. So you really have to be consistent that way. And the more as an industry we can be consistent, I think the better the information and the science that we acquire from our roasts will be better applicable to other roasters.
Absolutely, because if we're roasting the same coffee, even if we're roasting the same coffee on the same machine, and we're looking for a very specific result, and you're marking first crack at one point and I'm marking first crack at another, even if we have the same bean, same everything, those roasts may come out different just because of the information that we've exchanged.
I agree for sure. And really, we need to also be able to track our post-crack development, which is going to be super important, because if you're calling your crack 30 seconds before I call mine on the same coffee with the same heat application, then we're going to basically have massive disagreements about doing the same thing to our coffee.
That's exactly right.
And that's going to create a whole bunch of confusion too. So yeah, definitely that. Yep. The better we can be at tracking our data, the better we can be at applying that data.
I love it. So I have heard some people say that you cannot stop a roast if you're still hearing pops in the drum. Do you ever stop the roast while you're in the midst of first crack?
Yeah.
Me too.
Definitely, for sure. I was just like, really? Is that a thing? I mean, I guess there's all kinds of rules that I don't know that I shouldn't break. But yeah, that's one I didn't know I shouldn't break.
No,
okay,
it's not.
Okay.
I don't think it's a rule that we shouldn't break.
No, I like it. I think that I started thinking about that a little more once I started doing a lot more sourcing of green. Once you start to source green more, you start to do a lot more cupping roasts, and cupping roasts are a lot lighter. And you traditionally drop cupping roasts more in that kind of window of development. And so once you start to do that, you start to understand really a lot about coffee. But to be really honest, the first time I did that was when I had this awesome washed Colombian, and it had such a high amount of sweetness that at the lightest roast level, it tasted like orange juice concentrate.
Yum.
I mean, it was just crazy acidity with crazy sweetness. So I was letting it out still in first. Because it had so much sweetness, I had to keep all that acidity in it to keep balance. If I went a little too far with it, then it was just so sweet.
That's incredible. That's a good problem to have.
Yeah, no, it was.
I remember
an awesome coffee.
I worked with an Ecuadorian coffee that was actually really low grown, but it was growing in a climate that was super cool. And so the coffee kind of tasted like a very high grown, very floral Ethiopian coffee.
Wow.
But if you roasted it even like 30 seconds past the initiation of first crack, it would taste burnt, like nothing. It would be super plain. Yeah. So I would drop it 10 seconds into first crack. I'd never done that with a coffee before. And that's where that coffee was perfect, because it was so low grown and it was so like low density.
Wow.
And you could grind it and brew it just fine.
Wow, yeah. That's sweet. And that's where it just kind of like shows that the rules that we build, they're there to be broken down a little bit. You know what I mean? Like the rules are there to help us and to guide us, but they're not the end all be all. Like this is a sensory product. You know what I mean? We have to understand it. We have to pay attention. We have to taste it. The curve will never tell us if we're right or wrong. It's always in the cup.
So when you caramelize onions, where are you during that process?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's basically the same place I am with the beans. So for me, and even like a turkey or something, like I'm in my head, I'm very visual, and I'm inside the thing. And I'm kind of in a way visually seeing the energy make its way in, and then things change and come their way out, I want to say. So in a way, I'm visually understanding the way the moisture is leaving and the thing is browning. Yep. You know what I mean? So that's where my head is. You know, but then again, I also use my nose a lot. So I'm constantly smelling the caramelization rate, you know what I mean, off of the pan to know if I'm too fast or too slow. And I'm visually watching the edge, because the edge is where it's going to be hotter, to see if if the rate is consistent across the pan. And then I'm probably even visually watching the flame and watching the metal to move it around to make sure the heat and the energy application is very consistent.
What about audio? Are you listening
to
that?
Oh, for sure. So like that's one of the things it's the rate at which, I don't know how it's almost like you can hear popping or boiling water in oil. You know what I mean?
Sizzle.
That sizzle.
Yeah.
The releasing of the little pops of moisture, almost like the opposite of champagne, but in like, if you can imagine champagne bubbles coming out of burning oil but made of water, like really wacky, but you can hear that rate. And the higher the rate is, the faster you're caramelizing. So you definitely pay attention to that. As time goes on, you'll probably slow it down to where you won't get as much audible, and then you'll use more visual and olfactory, but definitely the audible. And the audible is really key in the beginning, I'd say.
Yeah, when I'm cooking onions, I'm doing the exact same thing. Not nearly to the extent that you have in your life, but yeah, anytime you're cooking anything, you have to be present, you have to be paying attention. And when you're charged with that roast of that coffee, you are charged with, maybe it's your business, maybe it is you're a roaster for somebody else. One little thing goes off and that coffee is now no longer usable, or at least no longer going to be the same as it would have been. And a lot of those things can happen between yellow and first crack. So stay with your coffee, get on that dryer and smell it a few times. You don't have to like inhale the entire time the coffee's roasting, but be present. If you hear that outlier, note it as an outlier and wait until your first crack is really underway. If you have a first crack that is too slow compared to usual, even if your charts look right, it could be that your coffee is roasting too slowly. If your first crack comes in and just blasts, it could be that you've added too much energy to that roast. So paying attention, using your physical body to understand what's happening with that coffee is super important.
Definitely. And then making sure you taste your coffee.
Taste your coffee.
It's all about the taste. You know what I mean? Like that's where it's going to really prove itself out for sure.
And this is why we didn't want to get super nerdy today about exactly what's happening during Maillard, what's happening during caramelization, because these two reactions kind of dovetail together.
Yes.
They work simultaneous, and there's no way that we can isolate any one thing that's happening.
Right.
But what we can do is steer that roast toward our sensory ends, and then see if those sensory ends have been met by tasting the coffee.
Tasting the coffee, for sure.
This has been another episode of Roaster School. Please join us again next time for Roaster School number 4, where we'll get into the end of the roast. If you have questions, always feel free to reach out to us. We are both here basically answering your questions all the time. So you can just get on the phone and talk to us. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks.